Kia ora, koto katoa. Greetings, everybody. Welcome to this session. Hello from Aotearoa, New Zealand, University of Auckland. My name's Kim Phillips. Very sorry not to be able to be with you in person, but really pleased that the conference organisers have managed to come up with an online alternative. And these are strange and troubling times, but it's nice that we're able to get together, even if it's in virtual form rather than in person. Before I start my lecture, I just want to give a few words of thanks. First of all, to John Ott, first and foremost to John Ott, President of the Medieval Association of the Pacific, who invited me to be the plenary speaker for their meeting this year. And my warm thanks also to Ned Skillman, who took care of all the bookings and then very patiently took care of all their cancellations also, and to Anne Lester of Cara, who set up the respondents for this session. I'm grateful also to the extraordinary executive of the Medieval Academy, Maureen Miller, Catherine O'Brien O'Keefe, Lisa Fagan-Davis, and Ruth Matzo-Karras, and of course all of those behind the scenes who worked first of all to put together an incredible program of papers and then to move the whole shebang online. We're all learning new skills in this process. I hope next time we can do this in person. And without further ado, I'll move then to my lecture. Today on the Canary Island of La Palma, one can walk down the Calle Francisca de Gasmira. The street is named for an indigenous Canarian woman of the late 15th century, alternatively known as Francisca Palmenza or Francisca de la Palma. Her birth name's unknown. She was baptized Francisca by Spanish missionaries upon her conversion to Christianity sometime during or before the 1490s. Francisca is remembered in Canary Islands history as a mediator between the Canarian indigenous people and the Castilla conquerors of the late 15th century, but there's more to her story. By Francisca's time, Europeans had been attempting conquest of the Canary Islands for nearly 150 years. The island's first peoples, often given the generic name Guanches, probably began arriving from northwest Africa in the region of today's Morocco as early as 1000 BCE, and they developed autonomous cultures cut off from the wider world and also from each other. Little impacted by Europeans until the 1330s, they were from that time subject to contested efforts at subjugation by Portuguese, Castilian and papal powers, while Genoese and Majorcan merchants began plundering the islands for slaves and the precious dyestuffs of orchil and dragon's blood. Unlike certain other examples of medieval European encounters with distant cultures and nations, such as the complex story of their travels into Mongol-controlled Central and East Asia, European contact with the Canaries was exploitative from the outset. Castile dominated efforts at conquest from 1402, which came to a head in the late 1470s when the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, got involved, and their conquistador, Alonso Fernández de Lugo, notorious for his cruelty, completed annexation of the final group of islands, culminating with Tenerife in 1494-6. Many indigenous Canarians were subject to enslavement and displacement, and their lands taken for settlement by Castilian, Portuguese, Italian, Catalan, Basque, and Flemish immigrants. Francisca de Gasmira was instrumental to de Lugo's success. Franciscan missionaries had been at work in the Canaries from the mid-14th century, but with limited results, but gained a more enthusiastic hearing when from 1434 the papacy made it an excommunicable offence to enslave converts to Catholicism. Once Ferdinand and Isabella were on the scene, they enforced the natural corollary to papal edicts by declaring the legality of enslaving unconverted Canarians and made converted natives their free vassals. The monarchs stated their own modus operandi in blunt terms. They said, "The conquest proceeds by preaching as much as by force of arms." Theatrical conversions of some Canarian leaders followed, joined by mass conversions. In 1492, when de Lugo was beginning his campaign to subjugate La Palma, having succeeded in conquering Gran Canaria shortly beforehand, missionaries turned to Francisca de Gasmira for her aid. Francisca was a native of La Palma and, as I've said, a recent convert to Catholicism, and had married a Spanish councillor of Gran Canaria. In Ryan Crew's words, according to records detailing her role as mediator, the Spanish governor and the bishop authorised her with being the, quote, interpreter, unquote, of the Spanish terms of peace and the, quote, cause, unquote, by which the natives could trust in them. Francisca's persuasions worked, and she brought the greatest chiefs to Gran Canaria, where they were baptized and clothed in Spanish garments to symbolize their so-called rebirth, and went back to La Palma to oversee mass conversions. Thus pacified, to use the language of the conquerors, the inhabitants of La Palma put up little resistance to de Lugo's final assaults. But the perfidy of the Spanish method is seen in de Lugo's actions. He had forced Francisca to hand over her own children as surety for the deal, but rather than return them to their mother on completion of her task, he instead sold them and thousands of Benajoitas, the indigenes of La Palma, into slavery in Spain. Francisca saw his treachery, and from 1494 to 1515 she waged a lawsuit in Madrid for their freedom, ultimately securing the release of a reported 3,000 Canarians and their return to the islands. But the longer damage of conquest was achieved, and henceforth the archipelago belonged to Spain. I begin with this dreadful story to introduce my central purpose today, which is to illustrate some ways historians can do more to highlight gender in histories of medieval European expansion. My hope is that by putting Francisca and other women of medieval colonial contexts in the spotlight, and by examining the construction of conquest masculinities too, we might not only bring greater attention to the tragic indigenous histories, but also expose colonizing men, their version of toxic masculinity, and exploiting, among other things, women's labour and fertile potential to pursue their own ruthless quest for gain, and, finally, the long-term failings that are still playing out all around us. Many historians of early modern and modern contact, conquest and colonization, inspired by the post-colonial feminist studies that took off in the 1990s, have called attention to the role of gendered and sexualized concepts and relationships in structuring and naturalizing European expansion. Think of works by, among others, Ballantyne and Burton, Enloe, Grimshaw, Hall, Levine, McClintock, Montrose, Morgan, Sinha, Sharp, Stoller, Trexler, et al. Raewyn Connell in 1993 set the scene for gendering world history, stating, "The history of how European, American culture, economy and states became so dominant and so dangerous is inherently a history of gender relations, as well as interwoven with class relations and race relations." Since then, textbooks by Mary Wiesner Hanks, Peter Stearns and Bonnie Smith have summed up specialist key findings on gender in global histories. Now, among medieval scholarship, or within medieval scholarship, much important work has been done by literary specialists, including, to name just a few, Sharon Kinoshita in her Medieval Boundaries, Megan Moore in her Exchanges in Exoticism, while questions of gender and sexuality recur or pervade Geraldine Heng's work, Invention of Race. Historians including Sarah Lambert and Sarah Hamilton in their edited book, Gendering the Crusades, Peter Beller in works such as his article on black women in medieval scientific thought, Heath Dillard's classic Daughters of the Reconquest, David Nirenberg's Communities of Violence, Natasha Hodgson's Women Crusading in the Holy Land, Susan M. John's Gender, Nation and Conquest, and Sparky Booker's Cultural Exchange and Identity, realise gender and sex's centrality to medieval cross-culturalism. Yet, in general, I believe historians could do a lot more to make these themes mainstream. Perhaps it's the curse of being a feminist historian. One always wants more. Gender barely features in J.R.S. Phillips's classic and wonderful study on the medieval expansion of Europe, from which, of course, I've drawn my title. Likewise, women and/or gender appear only occasionally in the 12 volumes of collected essays edited by James Muldoon and Felipe Fernandez Armesto under the serious title The Expansion of Latin Europe 1000 to 1500. Now, these are admittedly older works now, but not so old. Gender is not named as a core theme of the University of Texas or Oxford-based Global Middle Ages projects either. And it makes an occasional, but so far as I've noticed, not frequent appearance in the key new journals of the field. In the General Editor's proposal for a 6-volume series on cultural histories of exploration I've recently been asked to contribute to, gender is not mentioned at all, ditto women and sex, much less does it have any kind of structural priority. So I feel we can do more. To be clear, apologies here for stating the well-known to many, but writing gender histories is not simply a matter of paying attention to women's voices and experiences. That vital work is women's history, not gender history as such. The two fields, of course, are overlapping, but they're not synonymous. Gender history does two things. Or at least two things, but these are two of its primary tasks. It explores historical constructions of masculinities, femininities, and other genders, and the ways that those categories are mutually constitutive and context-specific. And secondly, it explores the ways that gendered imagery, language, concepts, and expectations shape wider discourses of power and subjugation, privilege and disadvantage, inclusion and exclusion. It's always intersectional, as it mingles with constructions of class, race, religion, and age, among other categories. Now, to a lot of scholars, these points are painfully obvious, but to others, they've barely made any impact. If they'd made more impact, we'd be seeing more studies coming out by now. But now that world and global histories are entrenched in university curricula, and now the global Middle Ages is more belatedly established as a real and vital force in medievalist scholarship, now that university teachers are seeking ways to decolonize their curricula, and now that indigenizing traditional disciplines from classics to medieval studies and beyond is recognized as more than a trend, but rather a moral imperative, I want to issue a reminder about gender and also sexuality as key categories of analysis in histories of cross-cultural contact and expansion, and to offer some ideas about how this might work. So here I'm suggesting some ideas for ways that we might do more to gender histories of the medieval expansion of Europe. This list is by no means comprehensive. One thing we can do is to look for ways medieval authors underscored a narrative of strangeness through highlighting shocking, or what they perceived as shocking or scandalous, stories of so-called outlandish women, effeminate men, monstrous bodies, curious marital practices, improper or inverted gender roles, sexual promiscuity, flagrant nudity, sodomitic habits, and so on. We should seek stories of sexualities and genders beyond the pale, notably incestuous, bestial, and same-sex acts, and genders not fitting the Western male-female binary. So that's one way forward. Conversely, we can highlight sameness. We can highlight narratives that focus on an indigenous or other non-Christian people's monogamy, consensual marriages, rejection of divorce, modesty in clothing, repudiation of homosexual acts, and so on. These points of perceived sameness could be powerful elements in rhetorical defences of peoples for whatever purpose. Or, carrying on with the range of possibilities, we could seek out examples of gendered language and imagery which portrayed acts of conquest, such as sexual conquest, and conquered lands and peoples. So, for example, nubile virginal women, so lands portrayed as nubile virginal women, or conversely as barren places devoid of productive fertility. We may alternatively find examples of misogynistic or sexualized phobias and fantasies. So, for example, of women or hybrid beasts that are alleged to feast on men, or of sexually voracious women who seek intercourse with newcomers, or of young men diverted into extremist behavior, such as the story of the assassins, through promise of sexual reward. We might discuss European speculation about scientific theories of climatic zones and their impact on dress and nakedness, sexual morals, gendered character, and so on. We could seek examples of the invention of tales of supernatural intervention by feminine figures to assist with colonial acts of subjugation. For example, the story of the version of Candelaria in the Canaries, in which it was told that about the year 1400, the Virgin Mary appeared to two native shepherds and undertook miracles, as a result of which a cult formed around an image of the Virgin that, it was thought, prepared the Guanches for the work of missionaries and their ultimate conversion to Catholicism. Or we might think, in a different setting, of St. Bridget in Ireland, whose perceived good influence on the Irish predated English incursions. Another thing we can do is to emphasise the place of slavery in medieval economies and take heed of the long acknowledged fact that slaves in this period were often women and children. Within that theme, we could explore biopolitical facets of interracial coexistence, including wet nursing, sexual appropriation, and prohibitions on miscegenation. We can examine legal and social historical sources for evidence of imposition of Catholic models of marriage and family life on conquered peoples, such as outlawing polygamy, condemning pre- and extramarital sex, imposing Christian regulations on incest and contraception, insisting households be male-led and closing down women's opportunities for public roles, banning divorce, concubinage and temporary marriages, regulating and limiting interracial sex and marriage, condoning rape and sexual exploitation of indigenous women. Another thing that we should and really must start to do more is to seek non-Christian and indigenous perspectives and responses to the imposition of Catholic, Christian, sexual and gender norms upon them. But to come to the end of this list, I want to come to a theme that's my main focus for today, and that is to examine narratives of the indigenous or non-Christian woman, such as Francisca de Gasmira, as what we might call a bridge between worlds. For example, as interpreters, guides, religious converts, and or as sexual, romantic, and marital partners of conquering men. And the Saracen princess motif, which will be well known to anyone well versed in Old French epic and romance, offers a strong medieval example of this theme. Intermarriage offered an incredibly potent legal path to the acquisition of territory for conquering powers and the establishment of influential kinship bonds, as well as providing an unbeatable narrative of cross-cultural acceptance and assimilation. Women who served bridging functions in these ways inadvertently often assisted with their own culture's downfall. Now, these are suggested approaches, ones that have had some medievalist take-up already. You're probably thinking of others. I don't imply that themes found relevant to early modern and modern contexts necessarily fit every medieval scene of cross-cultural contact, in particular non-colonial zones of contact, thinking particularly of the medieval European presence in East Asia, do not inspire or require all the same responses as colonial ones. Indeed, that was a basic message of some of my existing publications. But I believe all the approaches listed on this slide have relevance to medievalists and that there's much more work to be done, especially in historical studies, but also in literary and art historical ones. But let's come back now to this theme of the woman between worlds. And I'm going to propose here that we call her the auxiliary woman. The story of Francisca de Gazmira is one such that illustrates the male conqueror's dependence on a woman in order to effect his final conquest of territory. Such stories reveal a knowledge that can't be openly spoken about, that is, that the conqueror is inherently weak. He cannot necessarily count on his masculine force as a warrior in order to prevail. He may need feminine help, and he may yet fail. Now, the auxiliary woman, again, I've broken this down into a number of different variants, and I'll give suggested names to those here. First of all, the tragic collaboration plot. This involves an indigenous woman as intermediary between cultures, aiding conquerors as an interpreter or conveyor of messages, sometimes assisting with the conversion of natives or indigenous people. And again, the example of Francisca de Gazmira, as already discussed, but also in the Canaries, the figure of Isabel the Canarian in the 15th century French epic Le Canarien, who was compelled to interpret for Gadifer de la Salle's faction and was at one point thrown into the sea by the party of Gadifer's antagonist, Bertin Berneval. And in the early Spanish Americas, La Malinche, died 1529, Hernan Cortez's Nahua interpreter and mother of his son, offers a prominent example of the tragic collaboration plot. Now, the question of female agency is a vexed one here. The woman's collaboration, for want of a better word, may be purely voluntary, but is more likely, or maybe often, necessitated by the prior disruption of her world, by the presence of invaders, and may also be complicated by long-established inequities within the indigenous world. That seems to have been the case in La Malinche's case. She may have been enslaved by her own family or community in childhood. So we need to question what agency means in a context where a woman might be fighting for her survival. A second variant of the auxiliary woman story is what I'm calling the intermarriage plot, in which marriage between an invading or settler party and indigenous or non-Christian woman confirms and solidifies military conquest through legal affirmation, property acquisition, and the formation of kinship bonds. In such unions, a woman's agency is immaterial. Her marital destiny is decided by male family members and prevailing legal systems. Examples include the marriage of Aoife and Strongbow in Ireland, who I'll be coming back to in a moment, and Byrd and Carton and several other Byzantine princesses in the Golden Horde. And thirdly, then, there's what I'm calling the romantic passion plot, and the Saracen princess tales could come under this heading. These are stories of alleged or so-called sexual passion and family betrayal. These seem to come at a slightly later stage of conquest and settlement. They're not part of the initial cultural contact phase. While there are variations between these stories, they feature usually some version of a love story between a non-Christian or indigenous woman and a Christian hero. The heroine converts to Christianity and helps her lover bring about the downfall of her people. Saracen princess stories feature in tales of the matter of France and the Crusades and have been studied by many distinguished scholars. In Frederick Warren's terms, the Saracen princess is a resolute advisor, an enemy to her own people, a willing apostate. Again, remember, we're looking at stories here, and the question of women's agency is very much a moot and complex point. Now, these female actors are invariably cast in a supporting auxiliary role, though they're pivotal to the conquest's success. The lead part that they support is that of the conquering power, whether figured as an individual, such as a conquistador, a political authority, such as the crown, or religious ideology, such as the church. Now, auxiliary women, such as I've described, have had at least some attention from scholars, but the gender of the conqueror also demands and commands our scrutiny. The conquering power is gendered hegemonically masculine. no matter whether individual females, such as queens, thinking of Isabella, or Elizabeth, more recently Victoria, are in power or not. Because ultimately it is patriarchal interests that are served. It's also white or European, Christian or Western, four interrelated terms and concepts that all add up to the same thing, the perceived right to rule by members of core European powers. For the late medieval period, we're thinking of Spain, Britain, France, Portugal, and the Holy Roman Empire. The pair of auxiliary woman and conquering man, I suggest, are mutually constituted in a gendered asymmetric relationship of master and servant, white and native, Christian and pagan, masculine and feminine. As Frantz Fanon argues, figures of settler and colonize are brought about through a process of mutual construction. Imagery of the auxiliary woman co-opts, appropriates, sanitizes, and romanticizes indigenous peoples under conditions of intense violence and danger. And the masculine, so-called heroic figure produced through this dialectic gains authorization to dominate. For metaphorical purposes, I suggest we could use the simple term conquistador to apply to any kind of Western conquering power, not only the Spanish. Collective or individual, secular or ecclesiastical. Sometimes the conquistador is a knight, sometimes he's a mercenary, sometimes an explorer, a judge, a governor, a merchant, a banker, a farmer, a land agent, a priest, a doctor, even a poet or a scholar. Sometimes the conquistador is a woman. A study of the medieval expansion of Europe is therefore a study of the seizure of lands and peoples by and in the interests of a masculine Western hegemonic regime with the underlying goal of economic exploitation, the creation of wealth, and the concentration of that wealth in the hands of a narrow elite. I want to move to another context now and to more specifics. This is the context of 12th century Ireland at the time of the first attempts at invasion and conquest by the Anglo-Normans, and I'll be referring to them as the Angles. The figures of conquistador and auxiliary woman feature in medieval narratives of one of the earliest episodes in medieval colonization, the late 12th century, invasion and partial conquest by Anglo-Norman forces, mostly Norman Welsh, serving the interests of, simultaneously, King Henry II of England, Diarmait mac Machada, the displaced Irish King of Leinster, and themselves. The story is told by a number of writers, including Geraldus Cambrensis, or Gerald of Wales, in his Expugnatio Hibernica from 1189, and in a late 12th century anonymous verse chronicle, Largesse des Anglais en Irlande, formerly known as The Song of Diarmait and the Earl. Both of these books relate the 1152 abduction of Derfagail, the wife of Tigernán O'Rourke, King of Breffni, by Diarmait mac Machada, the King of Leinster, the event that ultimately led some years later to the arrival of Anglo-Norman forces on Irish shores. In contrast with contemporary Irish annals, which lay responsibility for Derfagail's departure at the feet of Diarmait or her brother, Anglo-Norman authors blame Derfagail herself. So Largesse des Anglais en Irlande portrays the lady, whom it doesn't even bother to name, as complicit in her own abduction, saying the beautiful wife of O'Rourke, she treacherously loves Diarmait. Seeing his chance to avenge an old wrong done by the men of the north, Diarmait sends words of feigned love to the lady, who urges him to come to her with the full army of Leinster. And Gerald of Wales, or Geraldus Cambrensis, goes further, stating that Diarmait, who had long been burning with love for her, took Derfagail of her own accord. He writes, no doubt she was abducted because she wanted to be, and, quoting Virgil, since woman is always a fickle and inconstant creature, she herself arranged that she should become the kidnapper's prize. After all, almost all the world's most notable catastrophes have been caused by women, witness Mark Antony and Troy. What's different about Derfagail as auxiliary woman, here in something like the Saracen princess role, is that her passion is for a fellow countryman, not an invader, and yet I suggest that the language of Largesse shows that this text's figuring of the conquistador is of a collective, and it incorporates the Irishman, Diarmait, and his followers as much as it does the Welsh Norman knights, including the famous Earl, or Richard Fitzgilbert, Earl of Pembroke, that is Strongbow, as he's traditionally known, whom he enlists to retake his territory. So Irish, Welsh and Anglais are all bound together under the same collective identity, and it also includes their English king, Henry II. Now, the Anglais of this work are not the English, as we might understand the term. Instead, they're men who've pledged allegiance to Henry II, the English king. So nationality here is not a matter of ethnicity, but of feudal bonds and loyalty and masculine gender. The Anglais are men who can be counted on to fight for their English lord, regardless of their ethnic origin. The book that I'm discussing was written by a Welsh Norman for his small military community in Ireland and was addressed to the successors of all those who took part in the campaign with the same purpose as Wenceslas in his Roman de Rue. That is, that men ought to preserve the memory of the deeds of their ancestors, the bravery of brave men, and the evil deeds of evil men by reading out histories on feast days. Now, close reading of the adjectives and other descriptors in this text shows that it treats Diarmait and his men and the Anglais as identical in gendered attributes, and in contrast to the Irish enemies of Diarmait. So reading the work for signals about gender, it's not hard to see how La Geste crudely shapes chivalric notions of hegemonic and marginalised masculinities and uses them to support the narrative of conquest. So the good Irishman, Diarmait, and the Welsh Norman knights who fight on his side in King Henry's service are all described with painful repetition in terms of the lauded chivalric virtues of wealth, nobility, liberality, strength, courage, valour, hardiness, boldness, renown, courtesy, and loyalty. The characterization really is about as subtle as a Monty Python knight, such as brave Sir Robin. Diarmait's Irish enemies, on the other hand, share not a single one of these qualities. Though they might be spoiling for a fight, it's only because they're traitors and rebels. The repetition of those two descriptors driving home the centrality of the value of loyalty to conqueror masculinity. Worse still, they're regularly said to feel fear or hatred. Their emotions are not those of worthy men. In the heat of battle, they run away. The conquistador is shaped there not only by comparison with collaborating or complicit women, but also by comparison with vanquished and humiliated men. In addition to Derfagail, La Geste has two other auxiliary women. Otherwise unknown figure called Alice of Abergavenny, a Welsh camp follower who appears briefly in order to decapitate 70 Irish prisoners in County Wexford, deliberately chosen for this job to shame the Irish, and, crucially, Eve, daughter of Diarmait, not even named again in La Geste, but who was in 1170 married to Strongbow in ratification of the deal between Diarmait and that earl, and commemorated in this extraordinarily florid 1854 painting by Daniel Maclise. Eve's wedding to the conqueror Strongbow provided the symbolic and actual foundation of Anglo-Norman claims in Ireland. Unlike Derfagail, Eve is devoid of character or agency in Anglo-Norman sources. What matters is that the property she inherited from Diarmait passed to Strongbow and thence into English common law. And thus, because husbands controlled their wives' property under common law, became the conqueror's possession. As Angela Wanhala says in relation to Māori Pākehā intermarriage in colonial New Zealand, this was an arrangement highly attractive to colonial governments. Marriage was much quicker, cheaper, and cleaner than war. Strongbow and Eve's combined estates and Pembroke title passed to their daughter Isabel de Clare to the immense benefit of her husband, William Marshall, successful soldier but landless younger son, and to their many children, from whose own marriages would grow many powerful medieval English families. Now, I don't want to leave the story there, with the conquests apparently completed and everything wrapped up. Retelling the medieval expansion of Europe through such methods as prioritising narratives of conquistadors, auxiliary women, and humiliated men exposes their gendered underpinnings, but leaves the mythical heroism of the conqueror intact. And I want to end by asserting his ultimate failure. When I began some months ago to think about my topic for today's lecture, I had a recurring mental image of men washed up. When cast on foreign shores, the would-be conqueror is at the mercy of those who may choose to help, ignore, or destroy him. Narratives of his dependence on the auxiliary woman reveal the man in crisis, clinging to survival and confrontation with ruthless nature and hostile humanity. Without help, he would die or be slaughtered like countless European souls who've vanished from our history books. So the conquistador is a teetering figure. Haunted by the spectre of total failure, he's a hand's breadth away from being forgotten too. And I want to end by insisting that this history is not finished. From the perspective of present-day Aotearoa, New Zealand and Australia, and no doubt other settler societies too, these themes are fully relevant today. The colonial is not past, the conquest is now. For inhabitants with European ancestry, we too are conquistadors. At best, we might be auxiliary women. In these burning times, our methods of settlement, land use, and our exploitative economies are shown to result in catastrophe. We must see the failed masculinities of those who claim to rule us, and the ways we aid, abet, and collaborate in their aims that are potentially leading us to ruin. And we also need to hear the voices of the conquered men and women who've been trying to get through to us all this time. Thank you very much.